back. WNST, Taos, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are AM 1570. Big thanks to all of our sponsors, including our friends at Taharka. I do want to promote one thing with Taharka before we get going. The pistachio ice cream. I know it doesn't sound like much because you're thinking, well, I like chocolate or I like vanilla or I like strawberry, the roasted strawberry. But the pistachio, I did not have this, Luke, for about 4 weeks. And I went back to the factory and I picked it up, and I actually picked up 2 of them. One of them I was going to give to you or give to my son or somebody I like, Don Moeller. I'm not giving it away. I'm going to eat it. You're going to have to wait. How about that?
My mom loves pistachio, so I'm going to have to get you to hook me up with that.
All right, for sure. Your mom, I'll make an exception for your mom, for not anybody else. How are you, man? Baseball weekend. My ice cream would be melting if I was still waiting through that rain delay on Sunday, but this is the strangest thing because, they looked like an A-League Sally squad against a similar A-League Sally squad, the Marlins, and they go to Washington. And you'll say to me, well, that's baseball. And I'd be like, yeah, that's baseball. But there's also a part of this that there's nothing about this that's even remotely normal from the players' standpoint of where the players are going to wash out in what really feels like maybe the first week of March in spring training for me right about now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if nothing's normal about it, but certainly there are things that are abnormal. We saw that with the Marlins series where the Orioles were the visitor for 2 games at Camden Yards. And
7-inning games. And I go through the list of all the things that have been bastardized just over the first 2 weeks, let alone the schedule and the COVID, right?
Well, just how about the fact that we're now roughly a quarter of the way through the schedule? I mean, the Orioles would have been officially 15 games through the schedule on Sunday, if not for a suspended game. And each starting pitcher has had 2 or 3 starts. I mean, it just speaks to how strange that thought is. You think of 2 or 3 starts for a starting pitcher in a given season, you're getting your feet wet. I mean, that's all that's about. You're not even panicking over the results unless it's really, really bad or you're reacting to something that's insanely good.
Well, my boy Jeff Mueller was texting me Sunday like, hey, they just knocked Strasburg out. Like, he thinks they're going to win the World Series, and I keep saying, A, they're not going to win the World Series. If they do, you can't go anyway, and you can't even have a parade. If they do, it's an 8-week season, and no one would take it seriously if the Baltimore Orioles won the World Series next month, right? So, but beating up on Strasburg, I said, that's not Strasburg. This is beating up in Strasburg in March. I mean, these guys aren't going 7 or 8 innings. I mean, the association we put with Strasburg and what that expectation is supposed to mean for anyone making that kind of money, including Chris Davis, it's not what we're witnessing right now. That's not the reality of what we're witnessing.
Well, I mean, certainly pitcher injuries have been a concern, and I think we've seen that. I haven't seen data, but just looking at it over a 2-week span, the number of arms that are hurt. We had some in spring training and some guys that were hurt during spring training and elected to have surgery when you have a 3.5-month shutdown. So I, without commenting on specific numbers, but it does look from an eyeball test standpoint that you're seeing guys that have gotten hurt, guys that aren't quite right. I mean, Strasburg, let's keep in mind, he had a nerve issue in his hand. I mean, he had started the exhibition game against the Orioles in Baltimore and hadn't pitched since then. So, you're talking 2.5 weeks roughly that was.
And he made it to the 5th inning.
yeah. So, but at the same time, I mean, hey, give the Orioles credit. I mean, they finally got to him in the 5th inning, and that was great to see. In terms of these trying to draw these conclusions, one thing I will say about this, that even though it is a 60-game schedule and that lends itself to being weird and having craziness, and we have 8 teams per league making the playoffs, I still think within a small sample size, you're still trying not to judge it too harshly, right? As a baseball fan, in the sense that...
Well, it's kind of like when Mark Belanger was hitting 429 2 weeks into the season. You knew Mark Belanger wasn't going to hit 429.
Yeah, right. But at the same time...
But he might over 8 weeks.
Well, and I was just going to say, at the same time, the Orioles being 7-7, that tells me that I certainly feel better about their chances.
Anything's possible is what you're saying. You're buying you're buying hope because on a short track there has been some evidence that on any given day Steve Strasburg might not be Steve Strasburg and you might be able to knock him out. I think that's a little different at the end of September. Once we get to the end of September, I think the wheels will be on Chris Davis will be batting 128 and, have 58 strike. I mean, the norm will appear at that point. But
Yeah.
for especially for pitching, I would think some of these pitchers kept their arms in incredible shape. Some guys went pitching, or some guys went fishing. Some guys said, I'm not blowing my arm out in the middle of COVID. Therefore, I'm not doing anything, because once this is over with, this arm's going to be worth $100 million. I don't know where the level of training was for any of these guys. And Luke, this isn't me picking on Angelos or the Orioles or baseball or Manfred. I watched some hockey over the weekend too. There's nothing about that says those guys are in any level of the same condition, the same way. Football might have a prayer. They're all getting together now. Like, if they actually go out and play this game against the Browns in 5 weeks, they all might actually be ready to play. I'm convinced in baseball and hockey, and I haven't watched basketball at all, there are some guys that this feels like August, and there's some guys this feels like February. And it's up to you and me and Brandon Hyde to figure out who's who.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I look at basketball. TJ Warren has been the MVP of the bubble, and I guarantee you hadn't heard of him. And I'd only heard, I knew of him, but certainly didn't think he was anything special. So
who?
It gets,
yeah, right.
Exactly. But it gets a guy who's hung 50 points on the 76ers last weekend and has had some big games. But
much to the chagrin of your family. Yeah, I know.
Right, exactly. More so the Ben Simmons injury, but that's neither here nor there. But this goes back to what we talked about last week in terms of how is everyone responding to this. And a big piece of this, as much as we talk about the virus and the risks involved there and just being shut down for months on end anyway, you had different guys and even motivations, as you alluded to. You have different guys who had different access to, whether it's other people, like a pitcher having hitters that he could throw to, or you had some guys that were throwing to a mattress in their garage, like John Means. I mean, you had or Alex Cobb, who didn't have much access to anything, and admittedly was a little bit behind some of the other Orioles starters. So you really do have all these guys at various levels, and I think football, it does have an opportunity to normalize a little bit more, assuming they can manage the virus aspect part of it. But yeah,
well, you remember how bad the preseason football games always were, with guys jumping off sides and penalties and all of that. Like, that's week one of the NFL is going to look a little bit like that, right? I mean, especially after not playing anybody else. No matter how much they practice, the cadence, the timing, all of that will be off. With baseball, was ready, go, set, right? Is kind of how they played baseball 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, they had a 3.5 week tune-up, and as you know, spring training's typically more like 6 or 7 weeks. So you look at it from that standpoint, it was definitely ready or not, we're going. And we saw that in 1995. You mentioned football, the 2011 strike. I think you go back that year and probably find some articles on sloppy play early in the year. And for me, though, as much as we focus on the play, I do come back to the health of pitchers. And we'll talk about this in the NFL with, I think, a lot of soft tissue injuries, hamstrings, groins. You hope not injuries like Achilles tendons and things of that nature, but it really is difficult, I think, to gauge. And I think that's why in the NFL, they push so hard to have the ramp-up period prolonged, more so than just trying to jump into a normal preseason. And that probably will prove to be wise. There's no way to really prove it because we're not going to see what the other scenario, how that plays out. But I think the health part of this, obviously from a virus standpoint, but getting into injuries that occur within the realm of play, that's something that I was concerned about all along with the pitchers. And I think you're seeing teams try to manage it as best they can. We do have a 28-man roster that's going to stay at 28 for the rest of the year after they were originally going to do 30 to 28 to 26. They upped it by one. They were going to do that anyway before this all started. So you're able to manage it a little bit more. And I think, let's face it. I saw some people over the weekend talking about the fact that the Orioles only had one quality start to this point. We know this isn't a great rotation to begin with, but that said, we are also seeing the game, and we've seen this fundamentally change in recent years where pitchers aren't going as deep. And if you do have a little bit of a deeper bullpen, it allows you to manage a little bit differently. So I think we're to go back to the idea of a short season, there are some elements of that where, you can probably manage a little bit differently too, and use your bullpen a little bit more. And it does lead to some different elements statistically. And we've seen that with openers and it's kind of warped starting and relief pitching splits and whatnot over the last couple of years. But they're kind of patchwork, they're pieceworking it together to try to figure this out. And to bring it back to the Orioles at 7-7 and looking like they were on their way to being 8-7 before the game was suspended on Sunday. Do I think their true talent level is a 500 team? No.
Can they go 8-7 the next 15? Yes. Then all of a sudden, there is what they tried to do for Jeff and Don Moeller and you, which is create a mini pennant race in September that never would have existed in a place like Baltimore had they played 162 games. They don't really care who wins. They just need it to be more compelling than, quite frankly, the product is, in my opinion, as someone who's watched sports all my life.
Well, and the other thing they really needed was the playoff game revenue. So that's why we're going to have 16 teams as opposed to the typical 3 division winners in the wild card play-in game. So, yeah. And what's crazy about this, we're talking about being at the quarter pole, and think about it. If this were a normal baseball season from a time standpoint, I guess a fraction of the season standpoint, we'd be coming up not too far away from Memorial Day at this point. We always say what about Memorial Day in the baseball season? It's typically when it starts to feel real. Typically at that point, which teams are going to be contenders, and
what you've got, but you don't have an 8-7 Oriole team. Maybe you do, I guess, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you'll have a little bit of that. I mean, the Nationals were a great example of that last year. That they were pretty terrible through their first 50 or 60 games, and wouldn't have been a playoff team, and they end up winning the World Series. But yeah, typically
now they fight more than Mike Tyson.
Yeah, and now you look at the standings, and okay, the Pittsburgh Pirates are terrible. They're kind of the team that record-wise that everyone thought the Orioles would be. And maybe the Orioles will be right there when we're talking in 2 or 3 weeks. But the longer this goes on, and the fact that we're a quarter of the way through, and maybe the Orioles have made some improvements in certain areas. Not that they're going to win the World Series, but they're maybe not that 115, 108 loss team that they've been the last couple of years. And then you get on a roll for a little while, and you never know. In fact, it's funny. One of my good friends over the weekend sent me an article. I think ESPN did it, talking about some of the worst teams that had really good 50 or 60 game stretches. And
I saw that piece. Yeah,
two teams that were on that list: the 2005 Orioles, which, as you remember, Nestor, were in first place for a good chunk of the first 3 months of the season, and then
that was the Palmeiro finger wagger. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I remember
Palmeiro.
God, that feels like a minute and a half ago. It's 15 years ago. Wow.
Yeah, Palmeiro and Bedard got hurt at one point, and the pitching fell apart, and the stuff with Tejada and Palmeiro, and then the other year
it was B12. Come on,
exactly, the injections. But and then in 2010, remember the Orioles were historically awful for the first 4 months of the season, and they hired Buck Showalter, and they went 34-23 the rest of the way. So bad teams.
You take 34-23 right now, wouldn't you?
They would be playing in October. So, I mean, it would definitely go against.
Do I get to buy an October Hunts sweatshirt with the Oriole logo on it? If they
they'll have all of that, because they've had that in regular years. They're trying to sell as much merch as they can with given the circumstances. But again, I mean, it just comes back to statistical noise, and you're going to have weird things that happen over 60 games that typically will normalize when you throw another 100 games onto that, like we normally play. But it's made for certainly different baseball, and certain elements of it are weird. And I'm not going to say I love everything about it, but for the most part, it's been enjoyable. And bringing it back to the Orioles, yeah, they've had their series like the Marlins series where you say, wow, that was just kind of listless. But then they go to DC and take the first 2 against the Nats, and looking like it would have been 3 had it not been for some tarp malfunctions.
Hey, dude, we left them alone when they lost to the Marlins, because that was just some horrific. That's the lowest level of baseball we've ever seen at Camden Yards in 30 years. I don't know. Who are the guys on the field? Who are the performers? What are their names? Like that really, that was something, especially when when Mattingly came out and handed in the lineup card and had guys in it he'd never met.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you there. At the same time, the Orioles have had some, especially the last few years, some very low moments in that
They had
regard,
Alex Cintron in their lineup at one point in 2008. He snuck in here. Now he just mouths off in the dugout, and I don't even know what the hell that was. Do you have anything you want to say? Because the fighting is more interesting than the baseball to some degree, and certainly there's more noise that's not piped in. But the Astros and this tour they're on, the tour of shame that they're on right now,
Sure.
and throwing at their former guys in their organization and having Cintron be really like, I've never seen a more I don't even want to find – I don't want to find the right insult because I might insult the wrong people. But it was a less than masculine effort by him on Sunday.
Well, and typically you'll see some scenarios like that, but usually it's a player at the very least, but for it to be a coach. And I do think it's interesting from the standpoint of, first of all, we essentially stopped talking about the Astros because of everything that's happened with the pandemic and the shutdown and all of that. But you have these really contrasting realities that are conversing here, where you do have a league, a fraternity of players that are absolutely furious at what happened, even though I continue to remind everyone, the union signed off on what the punishments were supposed to be a few years back. I mean, that still goes back to, it's really easy to blame Rob Manfred, but the union was involved and knew what the penalties were, and they signed off on that.
The union has always protected the cheaters, always protected the liars, always protected the Jason Grimsley crawling through cat spaces to get dirty bats. I mean, but that's been going on forever. And then they figure, well, we'll determine this on the field. We'll show you how a real man handles this. We'll throw it in your ear.
And that's what is so disconcerting and frankly unsettling about this is you have, right or wrong, this mentality, this culture in baseball about policing themselves. We've talked about it many times. You can go back to Manny Machado and Yordano Ventura years ago and other incidents, but that's part of the culture. That's part of the reality of baseball, whether we like it or not. And then you try to marry that with the reality of social distancing and players on their own teams needing to stay apart, let alone
I can hit you in the back and you can't come and you can't come and get me.
Right. I mean, it's a very awkward, uncomfortable position. I mean, it was going to be awkward and uncomfortable anyway with the Astros, and now you throw social distancing in where you're not even supposed to be high-fiving and sitting all that close with your own teammates, let alone breaking out into a bench-clearing altercation. So, it's definitely and I think even with that, you probably have guys on other teams that say, oh, great, here these guys, they cheated, they won a World Series, they, in our minds, got a slap on the wrist, and now
they're going to hit me, and then this a-hole's going to taunt me from the dugout. This cheater with a ring is going to taunt me.
And there's this art. I don't want to say artificial because it implies that it's unnecessary. But they also feel now there's this extra overhead because with social distancing and everything, how we can't even think about getting in a fight with these guys. So I mean, it leads to a really uncomfortable position.
Well, now Manfred's got to play policeman again, which the commissioners are always so great at policing the players after they don't behave, right?
Well, I'd say this. I mean, after what happened with the suspension with Joe Kelly, you would think it has to be harsh, right? I mean, I know he was a repeat offender, and that was kind of the rationale for his suspension. But you would think, I mean, this kind of decorum obviously is bad for the game anyway. And then on top of it being a pandemic where you're trying to keep everyone apart from each other, and so I would think the penalties are going to be severe. We'll see how it shakes out over the next couple of days, but. Certainly, I can't say I'm surprised by it, though.
And the A's are the best team. This may throw their whole momentum off.
Well, and that, too. I mean, you look at the A's. I'm glad you brought them up because, I mean, you win 9, 10, 11 games in a row at some point over a 162 game schedule. That does move the meter a little bit, but you think about winning 9, 10, 11 games, you have that kind of a winning streak.
You almost buy yourself the playoffs in a 60-game season, right?
Unless you were just absolutely terrible. I mean, that the Pirates won 10 in a row now, first of all, I'd be surprised if that happened. But unless you're just so god-awful, I mean, to your point, you're kind of almost by default you're going to be in at that point because you played a really, really good 20% chunk of your season right there and won all those games. So that's what we're looking at right now. I mean, it's kind of easy to look at the Yankees, even though they lost a couple over the weekend, or we could certainly talk about the Dodgers, although the Rockies have played good baseball out in the NL West. But you look for those couple surprise teams, and all it takes is 2 really good weeks, and suddenly you're talking about a team like the Orioles potentially. Not just starting 7-7, but play well over their next week and a half, and suddenly you're talking about a team over 500 and not in the driver's seat because there's still enough baseball left, but we're having a different conversation than we're used to having over the last few years with the Orioles.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. He will be covering all things Ravens in Owings Mills. We'll talk some football a little bit later on throughout all of this. And just last thing on baseball for you, and this is more global for me, and this is me getting more into it with the Moeller family over the weekend, who they're all sitting around watching this like it's real baseball. And I'm not in any way treating like this is like real baseball, or that Barry Trotz is going to face off against the Capitals and it's going to be like it really would be if it were May 3rd and there were 18,000 people in the rink. It doesn't feel that way. It doesn't play that way. My mind won't let me play that trick on myself. We've talked so much about, suspension of belief that we go through when we go see Die Hard and we're hanging off the edge of the Nakatomi Tower, and it's real to us. Baseball, for part of the real is fans there. Part of the real is me being into it. Part of the real is me seeing competitive balance on it. Part of the real is a real schedule. All of it feels very, very barnstormer exhibition. I'm ready for Eddie Feigner to break out and start throwing underhanded in baseball. And the hockey thing is listless. It's absolutely listless without fans. They shouldn't even play hockey without fans because the fans are what make hockey great. And I think football, we're going to say the same thing about that. You could say about soccer and the singing and the EPL and all that. Football has an ebb and a flow, home and away, on third down, that even in the worst stadiums in the league, you feel it, you know it. It's going to be different. And with baseball, I haven't made the adjustment to empty. I haven't made the adjustment to half-ass pitching. I haven't made the adjustment to any of this to think that, they're the Orioles, they're my team, they might win the World Series, these are my players, they're building for the future. Any of those things, any of the crap that Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal and Scott Garceau are selling you for 3 hours every night when you have it on, I'm not buying it. I'm just watching it, and I don't think it's very good. And I'm going to stand behind that because these eyes have seen a lot of good in my life. This is the worst of professional sports I've seen this side of Shane Falco, and I actually had to look him up because Keanu Reeves is on a weekend special this weekend. So there.
Well,
I'll look that one up too.
I mean, I think anyone who had an expectation that it was going to be normal is they were kidding themselves.
They wanted it to feel normal for themselves, though, because everything else sucks. Your life sucks. My life sucks. Everything sucks. We thought putting the television on and the Orioles being there would make us feel better. And all it does is remind me that life sucks. That's what it reminds me.
But that's your mindset. And look, you're respected.
It's not my mindset. It's I put it on and it's not any good. It doesn't take me to another place.
It's your opinion.
It doesn't take me to another place.
You don't speak for everybody. I've happened to enjoy it. I think it's I keep coming back to this issue with you. Perfect is the enemy of good. I mean, if our standard is we either want perfect sports or no sports, then okay. I mean, it's going to be no sports then because we're not going to have a perfect scenario right now.
We're not.
I mean, I think, but to some of the limitations that you mentioned, it's not bothering me as much. I've watched the NBA in the bubble. Is it like normal? No, of course it's not like normal. I've watched baseball both in an empty ballpark as a reporter, and I've watched plenty sitting at home on my TV. Enjoying it as a baseball fan, I like it more watching it on television because it does hit you in the face a little more as a reporter if you're just speaking as someone who loves baseball.
How many times have you been down there to see empty stadium baseball now? Not the Chicago game, but the last 2 weeks.
I went to both Yankees games. I went to two of the 3 Rays games, and I went to 3 of the 4 Marlins games.
So tell me how that is different than sitting and watching. Because I would think on TV I would stand a much better chance than if I snuck in as you up at the ballpark next week and walked into that place empty and heard it sound like that. I even texted you the other day. I said, are they piping the sound in the stadium or just on TV? Because I can't tell,
They do, but it's not. And I've seen a couple people made the trip down to DC. I wasn't going all the way down there for not getting any, access.
They could have used you on the grounds crew Sunday round 3.
I know, right? We barely touched on that, but it's just unbelievable watching that. But I think because some people talked about it was a little bit louder at Nats Park, the fake crowd noise compared to what it is in Baltimore, and it serves as enough ambience that it's not too distracting to have dead silence, but it's not so much that you're not still hearing the dugouts explode over a home run or someone taking issue with a strike 3 call and you can hear someone cursing from the dugout or what have you. So it's definitely different in that way. And look, I mean, as a reporter, when you're in the press box, and you know this well, us sitting there watching Ravens games all over the years, that there are certain things you're going to pick up that TV doesn't necessarily pick up. So from that standpoint, there's a little added value. But from a pure enjoyment of the game standpoint, it is easier to kind of forget about there not being fans when you're watching on TV because they'll pipe in the crowd noise. I think it's a little more conducive for that. Depending on how they use their camera angles from a TV production standpoint, you can hide it a little bit more. That's one thing I've thought about watching a little bit of hockey. I'm not a big hockey guy, but depending on the camera angles, you won't necessarily have to see the empty seats as much. And when they tarp them off and things of that nature, it does probably help the presentation a little bit, but it's different. And I think it's interesting. You mentioned not buying what the Orioles are doing or that it's not a great product and everything. And look, that's your opinion and that's fine. And look, this was never supposed to be a great 2020 Orioles product anyway, just purely speaking from a competitive
that's one thing we've talked about here. The level of expectation once the Ravens hit the field against the Browns is that, oh my God, they got to finish the season because we might win, right? There's that going on for the Ravens. There's none of that for the Orioles, but there is that. I am sitting around every night and it's on, and I would love for it to be more compelling than it is. And I guess it gets compelling when they're 16-13 2 weeks from now, right? And they're the 6th seed or whatever the hell that would amount to, right? That there would be a pennant race in 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, I guess that would amplify some of this a little bit for me. I'm waiting for it to kick in. I mean, I at least know what Hanser Alberto looks like now. I mean, I know who Jose Iglesias is. I do wait for Alex Cobb and John Means to take the ball. So, I'm down with parts of the storyline.
Sure.
But the notion that I sit there and watch it 3 hours and don't do something else, it's not compelling in that way for me. It doesn't stop my night. And it doesn't take my attention away from anything else. And maybe baseball wouldn't do that with a bad team no matter what. I mean, I can probably go back to Buck Showalter and say that.
Well, and I've said this to you before, that was probably going to be the case if there were no pandemic and it was a normal 162-game season and everyone was healthy and pitchers were pitching at their highest level. And there was going to be some of that because I could speak as someone who – you know how much I love baseball. Back in early March, before everything shut down, wasn't terribly excited for the 2020 season because of what you just mentioned. I mean, this is still a team that's
no good.
If we're talking about it in baseball terms from a rebuild standpoint, they're probably still in the 3rd inning, let's say.
They're not trying to win right now. So
the I mean, the guys on the club are trying to win, but from a holistic standpoint, from a universal standpoint, yeah, they're still in rebuild mode. And yeah, they did call Keegan Aiken up over the weekend. We'll see him at some point. And Ryan Mountcastle will be called up at some point. And so we'll start to see some more pieces in addition to Austin Hayes. And we've seen Santander do good things. Hanser Alberto is someone that, I mean, he's 27. I never, even at the beginning of the year, would have said I never would expect him to be someone who's here moving forward for the long haul. But at the very least,
now they're in the pennant race. How do they trade pieces away?
Well, and that's the other thing too.
They gave away their best, one of their best pitchers the other day. You say their best pitcher, but one of their best pitchers for nothing.
An established reliever, sure. I don't think Richard Blyers.
They're going to need him in the pennant race next month.
I don't think he's someone who's putting anyone over the hump.
Well, that's why I'm not taking it seriously. You're trying to sell me on the fact that they're in a pennant race, and last week they're giving away one of the 5 players they have that's a major league player.
Yeah, but he's a 33-year-old left-handed reliever who was approaching the point where he's going to be making some real money in arbitration.
When it comes time to get Edwin Encarnacion out in October, you're going to wish you had him. I'll tell you right now.
But I mean, look,
I'd be nothing without the comedy, Luke.
I'm not trying to sell you on a pennant race or getting excited, but they've been okay so far. They have. They've pitched better than I thought they would, even if it doesn't show up in quality starts per se. The bullpen's been pretty good. I think they do have some other good young arms in that bullpen to pay attention to. Tanner Scott's been okay so far, and Cole Salser has kind of been a nice story, a 30-year-old who never really got an opportunity and pitched okay for the Rays last year, but wasn't on their postseason roster and ends up going on waivers, and the Orioles claim him. So, they've had some okay stories so far, and Hanser Alberto's hit the heck out of the ball, and the longer he continues to hit, the more I wonder about, maybe even if he's not a long-term piece for the Orioles, maybe he's the kind of guy that actually fetches them something really impressive. Who knows? But it's been a good story, and I think it's been fun by and large. It's certainly different. I'm not trying to sell you that pandemic 60-game schedule baseball is better or superior to what we know normal baseball to be, but I'll go back to what I said to you at the end of the 2018 season with the Ravens. Embrace the weirdness. I mean, that's because it's not turning back to normal anytime this year. So, some of the elements have certainly been weird. Although one thing that I'll admit, and I talked about this with Dennis last week, the extra inning guy on second base, it's almost like I hate myself because I kind of have liked it a little bit. It's something that I did not want to like. I certainly would not like to see it in the postseason, but it adds a different wrinkle. I mean, it's kind of, hockey. Do you want ties or do you want 5-minute overtime and a shootout? There's a little bit of that going on. So, some of these different ideas, let's see how it plays out. And I'm not going to try to sell anyone on it being normal or as good as the regular times, but has it been better than sitting there on a mid-May evening and having nothing on at all? Yeah, I think it has been better than that, and I've enjoyed it in that way.
He's Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke. You can find him covering all things baseball and football on the sports side of what we're doing at WNST.net. We're about to merge the Baltimore Positive and the WNST brands together. I've been up late working on that. You'll hear all of our work here and out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault. You can find him, Luke, at WNST.net, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, anywhere the World Wide Web travels and the mobile device takes you. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking Baltimore sports and Baltimore Positive.